Well, yeah. We don't have anybody sitting in the wings, do we? Okay. Didn't that young preacher hit a home run today? Man, blessed to have him. Today, we're going to study about the Boam boys. That would be Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And I wish I could do what Bill can do, and Dan and Brother Kelly, and have all that up here for you, and all the verses. I'm old school. Open your Bibles, 1 Kings, chapter 11. We remember in our closing last week about King Solomon. Solomon messed up, didn't he? He started out really good. He is on fire for the Lord. But the older he got, maybe the wealthier he got, and the more wives he got, he just got sidetracked. And I can only imagine. I remember I taught some high school boys class several years ago when I was a principal. And when I was teaching about Solomon, and I said, and Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And those high school boys said, now that's what I'm talking about. And I said, I've walked these halls up here at the high school enough to watch some of you guys operate. You walk one to class, and you run back around to get the locker where the other one's at, and you try to play a double field. You can't handle two. How much could you do like Solomon? Anyway, he messed up. Let's just look and see what the Lord had to say to him. 1 Kings chapter 11, look at verse 6. We're just doing a quick review here to remind us of how Solomon's going to pass the baton to his son. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. That servant, by the way, is going to be Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, at that time, was one of the servants of Solomon. We know Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And remember that son of Nebat, that's going to go on for a long time. The evil that Jeroboam does will last for generations. They'll be affected by it. But this is the servant that God tells Solomon, I'm tearing it away from you, and I'm going to give it to a servant. Nevertheless, verse 12, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of your hand of your son. out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the kingdom, but I'll give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. He made a covenant with David, and God's always faithful about keeping that covenant. He said, so there'll be one, Judah, that will be left in the name of David. But this servant that was working for him, Jeroboam, is going to end up with the other northern tribes, the 10 tribes. Now, where does Jeroboam come in? By the way, the last days that Solomon was, the last years that he was on this earth, for the first, he served for 40 years. When he took the baton from David, it was peaceful because David had fought all the battles. He'd secured the whole perimeter of all the nations around. So Solomon got to live in peace, called him the King of Peace, until toward the last. And the more he started messing up, God brought up some adversaries. He brought up Hadad, an Edomite. Part of that was when Joab, the commander of the army, went into Edom. He tried to kill every male that he could find. And Hadad was issued out of there, young, some of the younger boys, down to Egypt. And it's interesting to me, it seems like every time somebody got in trouble in Israel or somewhere, off to Egypt they'd run. Shishak was the king of Israel. Anyway, so the latter years, Solomon did not live in peace like he had started out because he had adversaries. And one of them is going to end up being Jeroboam. Look at verse 26, 11:26. Then Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Ephraim, of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, he also rebelled against the king. Now Jeroboam had some talents, and Solomon had noticed it. He had ability to be a leader, and so Solomon saw him, and he was a servant of his, in the same way that his father Nebat, but he had died apparently because it says his mother's a widow. But we see that Solomon had some skills, and Jeroboam had some skills. Solomon saw that. He put him to work. He gave him responsibility of the forced labor. And so I guess maybe to utilize what skills he had and also to keep him out of his hair. But Jeroboam here, it says, verse 27, now this was the reason why he rebelled against the king. Solomon built the Milo. I looked at that, Milo. And that was a big earthen thing that they would build out in front of the walls to give some protection if you're going to be invaded. I saw some pictures, old pictures, where it had been excavated, and it was like tiers of rocks. I mean, to climb up there to get to where you want to try to do somebody some damage, they're going to fling a lot of arrows at you before you get there, I'm sure. But this Milo thing, and I don't understand why Jeroboam had a problem with it. Do you? But anyway, it said he built, and he had a problem with that. Verse 28, Now the man Jeroboam was a valiant warrior, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he appointed him over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. It came about that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found him on the road. Now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field when Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces, representing the 12 tribes. In verse 31, he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight and observing my statutes and my ordinances, as his father David did." Now, God is handing Jeroboam 10 tribes, all the northern tribes. But it comes with a requirement. Let's see what he says. Remember back in Deuteronomy, we talked about when God said in chapter 17, he gave them basically 4 things, required them to do, the kings. But let's see here, and let's look at verse 35. He says, "But I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give it to you, even 10 tribes. But to his son I will give 1 tribe, that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen for myself to put my name." Here's the next 2 verses are really interesting. In verse 37, God tells Jeroboam, "I'll take you and you shall reign over whatever you desire." Now think about that. This is almost like when Solomon requested, "Just grant me wisdom," and God said, "I'm going to grant you that, but I'm also going to allow you wealth and power." Jeroboam here had a chance to basically name what he wanted to rule over, didn't he? "Whatever you desire, and you shall be king over Israel." And verse 38, here's the if part. "Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Thus I will afflict the descendants of David for this, but not always." Solomon sought, therefore, to put Jeroboam to death. This word got back, Ahijah the prophet, what he told Jeroboam about, "You're going to be a leader over 10 tribes." That got back to Solomon. Solomon had other ideas about who was going to follow him, and so he wanted to put Jeroboam to death. And like Hadad did, where's Jeroboam going to rush and hide at? Back to Egypt. And so Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and he was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Smart move. You know you got a death warrant on you. So he waits until the king Solomon dies before he comes back. And when he comes back, he presents a real problem for Rehoboam. We haven't got to Rehoboam yet. But just a quick review of the fact Solomon had different ideas. God didn't allow that to happen. God appoints Jeroboam, selects him to be the king over the northern 10 tribes. Here's Jeroboam's problems when he takes reign. For one thing, he never did believe God's promises. God told him, you can rule over whatever you want to. He didn't believe God. God told him, as long as you walk by my statutes, you got it made. He just didn't believe God. And that's going to show up here a little bit. Second problem he had, he was warned on a couple of different occasions, and he was even stricken with a crippled hand. We'll see that. That didn't do him any good. And the third thing, he didn't receive God's help because of the way he lived and the way he ruled. We'll see that too. So that's a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of Jeroboam. I'd like to think that Rehoboam's going to do a better job, but he doesn't. In fact, these two guys are typical of most of the 39 kings that were selected to rule over Israel. Bad guys. God said they were evil. And so we're going to get a chance now to see something about Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, we know, is Solomon's son. He was his pick. It'd be hard to imagine how many sons Solomon had to pick from. You know, just be hard to imagine the number. I know Rehoboam, I think he had something like 28 sons. I mean, okay, he had, I can't remember, 18 daughters, 28 sons, something like that. And he had plenty of wives. In fact, he inherited, I guess, his dad's harem. But Rehoboam was a man a lot like Jeroboam, made a lot of mistakes. Let's look at chapter 12, 1 Kings. We know that Solomon had tagged him to be his replacement. Remember what in Ecclesiastes, toward the end of his life, when Solomon was doing a replay of his life, and he was worried sick. He'd done all these great things, built all these great buildings, built the temple, built his palace, which was nearly twice the size of the temple, and built his Egyptian wife a house, all these things, gardens, irrigation. And he's sitting there thinking about it, and he says, I don't even know who's going to be following me. Probably some foolish, make all these mistakes. He wasn't wrong. Rehoboam had some problems. Chapter 12 says, Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Now when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, he was living in Egypt, for he was yet in Egypt. Remember, he got out of Dodge when the getting was good, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon. Then they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. Then he said to them, Depart for 3 days, then return to me. So the people departed. King Rehoboam, here was his biggest problem. He didn't listen to good advice. Then King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you counsel me to answer these people when they want me to lessen the yoke? Then they spoke to him, saying, if you'll be a servant to these people today. That was one thing I noticed, that Solomon, he was king. He wasn't going to be, he didn't serve the people. The people served him. And so they're saying, if you'll be a servant to these people today and will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them, then they'll be your servants forever. But he forsook the counseling of the elders, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who grew up with him and served him. These young men were probably some of the sons of the leaders, probably somewhat of the, I don't know if they were spoiled back then, but they had prestige. And so they advised him. 9. So he said to them, what counsel do you give that we may answer these people which have spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us? And the young men who grew up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you shall say to these people who spoke to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us. But you shall speak to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Wow. Then Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day as the king had directed, saying, return to me on the third day. The king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders which they had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I'll add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord, and that he might establish his word, which the Lord spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. That was a mistake. The response of the people when they told him, he said, my dad may have whipped you with the whips, but I'm going to whip you with the scorpions. I was looking at that. What they were talking about in the tips of a whip, they put barbs of metal, glass, whatever, to cut. And that's what they called the scorpions, because they would sting. And for him to tell the people, this is what it's going to be, what did the people do? How'd they respond? Look at the next verse here. Look at 16. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, well, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now look after your own house, David. Verse 18 says a lot too. How mad were they? Verse 18, then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the forced labor, and all Israel stoned him to death. What King Rehoboam do? He jumped in that chariot and got out of Dodge as quick as he'd get there, because he thought he might be next. So you see, Rehoboam started out on a bad note. And he was down to Judah, and he reigned there in Jerusalem. But he made so many bad choices. I don't know, as you could say, he made more bad choices than Jeroboam. Jeroboam, that son of Nebat, followed for generations the sin of Nebat, of Jeroboam. And so you've got two men here, one of the northern tribes, one overseeing the southern tribe, and both of them were bad and evil and continued to fly in the face of what God said. I can't help but think that the advice they got, Rehoboam ignored the older men, and there's usually wisdom in those older heads, but he went with those young guys he grew up with. A big mistake. And he proceeded to make worse mistakes than that. Jeroboam gets the great idea, hey, we don't have to go back to Jerusalem. I'm going to set you up a couple of places to worship here at Bethel, up at Dan. And so he fixes a couple of golden calves. I wonder where he got that idea from. And they were worshiping golden calves again, and in places they weren't supposed to be. He is appointing priests that did not come out of the Levites, and that was the tribe where the Levites, where the priests were coming from. And so he just kept flying in the face of God. And in the end, it cost him dearly. He had a son that had an illness, and he puts on this, he tells his wife, put on a disguise and go talk to this prophet and see if our son is going to make it. I take it, age of this son was not a little boy, but he wasn't grown. He was maybe a teenager. And I can't help but think that when this prophet told her, by the way, God let the prophet who was blind, couldn't see, told him when this lady's coming, said, it's Jeroboam's wife in disguise. And when she was coming down the lane, he said, hey, Jeroboam's wife, come on in. Here he's blind. And she's bringing him honey and bread and stuff. And he proceeds to tell her, let me tell you what the Lord said. That boy that you got back there, when your feet sets back on at your house, when you start to enter your house, that boy's going to die. And what's interesting, though, about that boy, God had a special place for him, that boy that died. Isaiah 57, it talks about, I don't know if I wrote that down. I want to see if I did. Yeah, I think I did. And I got to think about that. He picked a good person out of Jeroboam's family, his son. Isaiah 57:1 says, the righteous man perishes, and no man takes it to heart. And devout men are taken away, while no one understands. For the righteous man is taken away from evil. That boy was grown up in an evil house. The people knew he was good, that boy. They mourned his loss. But we know where that boy went. God took him home. And out of the worst family that you probably get into, here a good kid was taken, we would say early, but he was taken out of an evil setting. God always has a better plan, doesn't he? I wish we had time to talk about the young prophet and the old prophet in this. You really need to read that. We got hung up on it, and I called Dan. I said, "What? How come this old prophet lied and made this young prophet get killed by a lion?" Well, we know God means what he says and says what he means. And he did.